In Singapore after leaving the G7 economic summit in Canada. And to say that he shook things up there would be, well, an understatement. Not long after the president departed, his top trade advisor accused Canada of stabbing the U.S. in the back. Here's correspondent Ellison Barber.
On July 1st, Canada says it will impose roughly $12.8 billion worth of retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. Taxes on goods in two lists, variations of products made from steel, iron, aluminum, items many Americans have at home, yogurt, chocolate, maple syrup, coffee, whiskeys, playing cards, toilet paper, ballpoint pens.
I don't want to hurt American workers. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, but my job is to stand up for Canadian workers.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he does not want to impose the tariffs, but claims he has no choice.
But the administration's choice to impose illegal and unacceptable tariffs, illegitimate and unacceptable tariffs to Canadian steelworkers and auto workers and on the Canadian economy must be met with an equivalent response.
That news conference enraged the president and his administration. They say Canada has wronged the U.S. on trade for years, that the U.S.'s steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and the European Union are a national security necessity. President Trump says the U.S. is now looking at adding more tariffs, this time on automobile imports.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. Now, and I'll tell you this, to my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history.
One Republican congressman says the president isn't wrong when it comes to some of his complaints on trade, but he's concerned about a trade war.
In my district, I hear from farmers, I hear from heavy equipment manufacturers. All of them have concerns about tariffs, specifically with Canada. He needs to be strong in getting a better deal, but making sure, too, that we don't get into a full-fledged trade war. Tariffs could possibly lead us there.
There are also questions about what this could mean for NAFTA talks. U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross previously said the talks were separate from tariffs, but on Saturday, Canada's finance minister reportedly said they cannot work on NAFTA negotiations under the, quote, threat of tariffs.
Before President Trump traveled to Asia, he faced other world leaders at the Group of Seven Economic Summit in Canada. Allies that are upset over new tariffs he's imposed on steel and aluminum imports. Joining us now, one of the architects of that controversial plan, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro. Mr. Navarro, the summit ended with a nasty dust-up between President Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau. He held a news conference after the summit in which he said Canada will retaliate for tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on Canadian aluminum and steel. Here is Trudeau.
We move forward with retaliatory measures on July 1st, applying equivalent tariffs to the ones that the Americans have unjustly applied to us. Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
Well, President Trump responded with this tweet while flying here on Air Force One to Singapore. Trudeau of Canada acted as so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left. Very dishonest and weak. Question, Mr. Navarro, is that really how we want to deal with our second biggest trading partner?
Chris, there's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. And that's what bad faith Justin Trudeau did with that stunt press conference. That's what weak, dishonest Justin Trudeau did. And that comes right from Air Force One. And I'll tell you this, to my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history. All Justin Trudeau had to do was take the win. President Trump did the courtesy to Justin Trudeau to travel up to Quebec for that summit. He had other things, bigger things on his plate in Singapore, where you are now, Chris. He did him a favor, and he was even willing to sign that socialist communique. And what did Trudeau do as soon as the plane took off from Canadian airspace. Trudeau stuck our president in the back. That will not stand. And as far as this retaliation goes, the American press needs to do a much better job of what the Canadians are getting ready to do, because it's nothing short of an attack on our political system, and it's nothing short of Canada trying to raise its high protectionist barriers even higher on things like maple syrup and other goods.
Mr. Navarro, I got a lot to talk to you about, but I do have to press this. You used some very strong words. Stab in the back, special place in hell. You said that that came from Air Force One. Are those the views? Are those the words of the president?
Those are my words, but they're the sentiment that was on Air Force One after that. Look, Chris, this was just wrong what Trudeau was doing. The Canadians are totally bungling our trade relationships, and it's due to their leadership. Take NAFTA, for example. We'd have a deal. We'd have a great deal with NAFTA by now if the Canadians would spend more time at the bargaining table and less time lobbying Capitol Hill and our press and state governments here. They are just simply not playing fair, dishonest, weak.
Well, I want to pick up on this, though, Mr. Navarro, because it isn't just Canada. Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, released a photo of the summit, and there was no comment on it, but it certainly looked like it was President Trump against the other members of the G6, America's closest allies. And I want to pick up on this point, because the last time you were on with me on Fox News Sunday, you said that no country would retaliate for the tariffs that we're going to impose. But let's take a look at, in fact, what has happened since we last talked. Canada has announced tariffs on $13 billion in U.S. goods. The European Union will impose tariffs on $3 billion in American products. I understand, sir, that the objective of the president's trade policy, with your advice, some would call it a trade war, is to get the other countries to lower their tariffs on us, but hasn't the practical effect been to get them to raise their tariffs on our products?
So one of my favorite quotes of this president happened just yesterday when he said, "We've been the piggy bank for the world, and that's got to stop." If you look at Angela Merkel's Europe, you see a continent where we run a $151 billion trade deficit in goods every year. Germany has tariffs on autos 4 times higher than our tariffs on equivalent German imports here, and they sell us 3 times as many cars as we sell them. So on the issue alone, we have allies strategically, but when it comes to these trade disputes, these allies basically are robbing us blind. The president is not going to put up with that. And in terms of this retaliation, I want to get back to the Canadian miscalculation here. The Canadians, because this speaks to your retaliation.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to move on because we've got limited time.
Joining me now to discuss, Fox News contributor Lisa Booth and the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman. Mr. Heyman, I was interested that you retweeted today something from the New York Times that I think really well captures the attitude of the elite to what went down at that summit in Canada. With a petulant tweet storm from Air Force One, President Trump all but blew up the group of 7 nations that the United States has led for more than 4 decades and essentially declared open political war on America's closest neighbor. This is so over the top, this reaction. It seems to me that what you're experiencing, you and those who have that view, is just shock at the democratic process finally working. That for years and years and years, people vote in elections, nothing really changes. In 2016, someone's elected who promises to change things on trade and tariffs and all the rest of it, and you can't quite believe that he's actually doing it.
Oh, so here's the reality here, and the thing that I know so well. United States and Canada have no better relationship than any 2 countries in the world. And when we talk about trade, $680 billion in goods and services in the U.S. has a surplus in trade. This is our best friend. This is our best ally. And so to treat Canada in the way that we've been treating them, I think is unfair and inappropriate. That being said, I think calmer voices need to come in, and we need to find a path to solution. But don't get me wrong. This is about jobs for the middle class. Millions of U.S. jobs, middle class, good-paying jobs, are due to our relationship with Canada. And so I think that we have misplaced this. And I hear you. Look, I think there's a lot of excitement around populism, and you can clearly see that around the world in terms of voting and outcomes. But I think sometimes we put a gun to our head and start clicking the trigger, especially as it comes to Canada. I think we're making a huge error here, sir.
But why do you think that it's not okay for the president to just simply move forward on the things he was elected to do, and specifically to put the American worker first? There's one particular thing. I mean, everyone is going on about how amazing Canada is and Trudeau's this great saint. What's going? I mean, what do you think of what's going on right now in the NAFTA negotiations over this? The investor-state dispute settlement, for example? Just one example of this dispute.
Yeah. Well, look. That we need to have a dispute settlement of some type.
But let's
so
just
if we
explain,
disagree with each other, we need to.
Let's just explain to the audience what's going on here, which is that President Trump is trying to take out of NAFTA a provision that means that multinational corporations can get any disputes with a government dealt with by a bunch of bureaucrats, so that a foreign company that operates in America is subject to American courts. And it's Trudeau who's siding with big business against the democratic voice of a sovereign nation. Why is the elite defending that?
I'm not getting involved. Look, I'm not the trade negotiator here between our two countries today, but I can tell you this. This agreement has produced a lot of middle-class jobs. 35 U.S. states, their #1 export market is to Canada. And we have a very balanced trade. In agriculture, the U.S. has a surplus in agriculture with Canada.
Okay.
In energy,
I don't want to get bogged down. I don't want to get bogged down. I'm sorry to cut you, because we've rehearsed all those. I'm making a general point here, Lisa, about the fact that just the very notion of challenging this stuff is seen as just completely beyond the pale. How dare he even argue with our allies?
Well, were they paying attention to the 2016 election? Because, as you mentioned, President Trump does feel like he had a mandate. Look, his election and was a direct response to what we saw from President Obama, where Americans felt like we were weak on the world stage. And they elected someone who had a position of strength, who said that I'm going to go in, I'm going to shake things up, I'm going to change sort of the global, status quo that we've been seeing that Americans were dissatisfied with. And look, if you're President Trump and your perspective is the fact that the NAFTA deal is weak, how else do you extract extractions or in concessions without utilizing some sort of leverage? And I think that's where the aluminum and steel tariffs come into play, is President Trump trying to use that as leverage, against Canada and Mexico in these negotiations. Also, President Trump, look, he's already done everything he said he was going to do. He pulled out of the Iran deal. You look at the Paris Climate Accord, pulling out of that as well, basically sending a very strong message to the rest of the world that, if you're not with us on some of these issues, we're going to go it alone.
Right. Well, I agree with that very much. Ambassador, look, I hate to sort of, take a shot at your, I guess, former profession, but, I mean, isn't it also good news that finally, thanks to President Trump, we're sort of pulling the veil from this ridiculous game of diplomacy that goes on, where these diplomats craft these communiques that sort of try and accommodate everyone's view. They cover up the reality, but actually, behind the scenes, everyone's fighting and disagreeing. He's just putting that out in the open. It's just transparent, isn't it? It's better than diplomacy.
Look, I'm a pretty frank person and very outspoken. I think the Canadians would tell you that. And I made no bones about bringing up issues that were of concern to the United States. But at the end of the day, we have no better friend in the world. And when we sit down and we're just talking about trade and dollars and cents, you're missing the point of how important this relationship has been to the United States. They have been there for us at every twist and turn in our deep history with them, 150 years. They were the ones who helped ferret our diplomats out of Iran when the Ayatollah came in and took over. They were the ones who were with us at 9/11.
Oh, right. Look,
not only
he's
with us.
He's not trying to invade Canada. He's not trying to do that. They're still friends. He's just trying to get a fair deal for America. Lisa, last word to you.
I think you're right. Look, people weigh... They blow up everything with President Trump. The economy was supposed to crash under President Trump. That has not happened. With fire and fury, we're on the brink of World War III. That hasn't happened. So I think President Trump has earned some latitude in the sense where we've seen these overreactions, and they end up really not meeting, that place where everyone's overreacting. It ends up not being bad at all, and ultimately tends to work in President Trump's favor. So who knows? It's too early to precisely see where these trade negotiations are going to go, but I think he's earned some latitude.
Exactly, and I just think that it's ridiculous when all these experts just say, well, you can't say these things. It's just not on. You have to just follow the script that's been there. The script hasn't worked.
Well, and too, Steve, I think when people see that photo of other world leaders and President Trump staring each other down, they see leadership, they see a position of strength, which is what we hadn't seen and haven't seen or didn't see under President Obama. And again, I really think President Trump's election was a response to that weakness from President Obama. They wanted America to be strong again. They wanted America to assert itself again. And President Trump is certainly doing that. Whether you like it or not, he's doing it.
That's right. And, you know, you're exactly right. We'll see the results. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. We appreciate that.
Thank you. God bless you. And God bless America.